Yeah. So basically, when I was diagnosed during the pandemic, and I started this
Ah,
podcast
uh-huh.
as an excuse because I really wanted to. I mean, it just rocked my world. Everything in my life changed, and it was so overwhelming. And I really wanted to find out from other women who were diagnosed in adulthood if they had a similar experience to mine. And I have a journalism background, and so I thought, well, I want to interview other women, and I needed a platform for which to interview these women. So I was like, well, I'll start this podcast, um,
Great.
as instead of just kind of trying to have intentional conversations. And so it's been really eye opening, to realize, like, I selfishly started this podcast so that I could interview other women, and now um, it's been helping so many other women to hear about the lived experience of other women, and how that's really how we're learning about our ADHD. And it was funny because the first book of yours that I listened to was Buzz. And now
Ah,
reflecting on it, I realized, like, it was the memoir aspect, right, that I was drawn to. So, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this in my first email to you back in March, but I was interviewing a yoga instructor from Ottawa and was asking her about her, how she first sort of came to her ADHD diagnosis. And she had listened to an episode of The Current back in 2016, I guess, in which you were interviewed on that radio show.
oh, wow. I
So
don't
it's
even
all
remember
coming
that.
full circle, right?
Yeah. Katie, where are you and what is your journalism background? I'm really curious.
I'm currently in the Hudson Valley of New York. I grew up in Toronto and worked in, was the editor of the university newspaper and got into journalism that way. And then moved to New York in 2001 and met my husband down here, and worked in various newspapers. I like to say I got laid off from all the best New York New York City newspaper.
Oh,
I worked at the Wall Street Journal. I worked at New York Daily News,
oh,
and yeah, it was now looking back, as you also, I'm sure, can attest, journalism is ADHD.
perfect.
Everybody who works in
Yeah.
newspapers probably has ADHD, given the lifestyle and the late nights and the chain smoking and everything else that came with it.
And
Um,
the novelty is the
yeah,
main
right. The
thing,
novelty
right?
seeking, yes.
Yeah, you don't
And
get bored.
yeah, and that was really the first thing. I mean, I remember, like, leaping out of bed first thing in the morning when I discovered the school newspaper. And it was, like, really the first thing that ever drove me, where I had that, that adrenaline, and something I was so interested in and could spend hours and hours and hours focusing on. And yet still, flunked all of my classes and barely graduated with the skin of my teeth and all of that. So, yeah.
Why did it rock your world to get the diagnosis?
Well, I think, like many women, I mean, I was 45 and I had been diagnosed with depression and anxiety for most of my adult life. And was diagnosed with postpartum depression with each one of my children. My second child, it was postpartum anxiety. Really just feeling like, I was bad at everything, and my therapist was diagnosed with ADHD through her son, who was diagnosed. And, she had a similar experience to you, where she was like, this sounds an awful lot like my child.
Mhm.
And so she was gently suggesting to me for a couple years, that I should look into this. And I think, what her tip off was the paradox between what I was accomplishing and what I was doing in life versus how I viewed myself, right? I've heard it be referred to as piece of shit syndrome, which is, like, the best description I can hear for, that feeling that a lot of undiagnosed ADHD women have, especially wives and mothers. And so it wasn't until the pandemic that I really I was like, I'm not hyperactive. That was, I didn't relate to the hyperactivity element, and I didn't relate to the attention deficit element. I was like, I have an abundance of attention. I have too much attention on just the wrong things. And so I think it was the acronym that really, steered me away from really looking into it, until she
Right,
finally,
interesting.
in the pandemic,
Huh.
she was like, you really should start researching this. And then, as soon as I actually started researching it, it became my obsession. And then I realized, oh, like, we're not talking about hyperactivity here. We're talking about rage and focus and anxiety, you know, all of the ways in which it manifests in women. So
I found it as a journalist myself to be a really great story because there's so many dimensions to it. The overdiagnosis, the underdiagnosis, the medication, are you bad or are you sad? Are you in trouble? Are you causing trouble? All those questions are very interesting to me, especially as a mother of a
I
child with it.
know, and I think that's one thing I love so much about Buzz was just how you seamlessly thread together what it's like to be a mother, you know, and what it's like to experience the gender inequity in a relationship, and the overthinking and the constant questioning. And I was tearing up throughout most of the book because of that feeling like you're just getting it wrong, you know, and wanting so badly to do it right, and thinking about how like we just need to be present with our children, and how I think being present is something that is very difficult. It certainly is for me, you know. I'm too busy badly researching how to help the family.
No, work is so much more fun than raising children. Just demands these different parts of your brain,
especially when they're younger.
Yeah, you can't race forward and you can't be organized. But the other thing I was thinking of when you were saying this was the moment in the book where a friend of mine who's a neuroscientist, I was kind of pleading for help, and he said, well, you just have to be calm. Like that's something you can just do. Oh, okay.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think we've all been told, you know, do you just need to stop thinking so much? Like, oh, I've got to stop thinking. Okay, let me read a book on how to stop thinking so much. What can I do about that? Let me Google
don't have high blood pressure.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Okay, so now you came to your ADHD diagnosis through your son, like many women in adulthood. And what were some of the signs that you recall? This was what, 10 years ago at this point, or even longer?
Oh my God, more. I was 48 years old, so it was about 16, almost 16 years ago.
Wow.
But I knew something was wrong or off with me most of my life. So when I got the diagnosis, it was like a gift from my son, because suddenly there was a pattern or a logic to my behavior that hadn't been there before. And I also think it was a gift because I got plugged into so many resources and ways that I could learn about myself that like neurotypical people simply don't have. There's this great literature already now with ADHD where you can, I think that there's a lot out there that really helps you live a better life once you know where to look.
Yeah, you know, I'm curious if, having been diagnosed 16 years ago, there's been such a difference, I think, in just how we view it. I mean, even, excuse me, I was diagnosed so recently, but it just feels like there's been this, you know, mental health revolution in the last year or two, especially since the pandemic. And you bring into it social media and memes and TikTok videos. I mean, I can't believe how many women I have interviewed who have come to their ADHD through TikTok.
Oh, wow.
So
That's so interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's fascinating to me, like, is this a proliferation of diagnoses because of the situation that we're in, this sort of collective trauma that have all been experiencing basically since the 2016 election, or even before, you know, like this has been 5 years of some serious trauma in our nation. You know, do you feel like this is ADHD, or do you feel like there's something else happening?
Well, definitely there have been enormous increases in the number of people, kids, especially with depression and other mood disorders. And I think the pandemic really focused us on that. How much, I don't know if ADHD numbers have been climbing recently, but they certainly were for a long time. And like I mentioned, I think that there is a lot of overdiagnosis, and probably the TikTok and other social media might feed into that. But at the same time, there is still underdiagnosis. There's a lot of people like you who just only recently found out that this was the explanation for so much of your behavior. And I think that especially in classes of people without high incomes and a lot of good access to medical care, there's a lot of underdiagnosis there too.
Yes, absolutely. And I think too, I think we're, I hear from so many women. Thankfully, my experience was quite a positive one coming to my diagnosis, but so many women who are sort of told to lower their expectations by their medical provider, saying, it's just depression, it's just anxiety, it's just motherhood. And you're like,
those are all serious things.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But, that there's no correlation there at all. So now also in terms of your once you were diagnosed and that feeling, like looking through your whole life with this new lens, turning over stones here left and right, what are some of the things that you looked back at your own childhood growing up and thought, oh, well, the signs were there all along?
Well, one thing is I'm a very anxious person, and anxiety is a common comorbidity with ADHD. And I think that anxiety can stem from so often feeling out of control and you don't know why, right? So for instance, when I was younger, as a foreign correspondent, I walked into a manhole while I was chasing after somebody I wanted to get a quote from and broke my knee, or I once rode my bike into the back of a parked car and I would just feel like such an idiot. And I didn't realize that there were actually lapses in concentration that were happening. But it's something that I think when they happen to you, you feel like there's a strong instinct to deny them, right? To just say, oh, that was that one-time accident. But then they start happening over and over again, and you realize there's something going on.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I can't remember where I first read about it. It was just some of my kind of background research into your how you became a journalist, and you talked about how you would kind of transcribe, or you would keep journals in your childhood. That was sort of how you first got interested in journalism. I found that fascinating.
That's possible. Yeah, I think there were a bunch of reasons. I have 3 siblings who are all doctors. 2 of them are psychiatrists, which tells you something about our family. But they all were going into medical school. My dad was a doctor, and they were just marching into medical school as if there was like no even looking around. And I think maybe being the last kid, the youngest kid, I had a little bit more freedom. My dad always said, he would bet me that I'd wind up in medical school, but thank God, because if I made some of the mistakes I've made in my life, they would have had more serious consequences. But I was really drawn to reading and writing. I have shelves filled with journals, and my 2 siblings who did become psychiatrists, they were both English majors for a time, and they would feed me books. So I developed that lifelong habit of really loving to read. So all that poured into it. And then I think that there was also a certain oppositional defiance disorder that might have had an influence. And I'm not necessarily diagnosing that, but just saying that I was very, very anti-authority. And so what really drew me to foreign reporting was the fact that when I was growing up, I saw the United States pouring money into all these dictators in Latin America, especially, who were just brutalizing their people and stealing money. And it just outraged me. That was my cause célèbre, so I determined that I would get myself down there and write about them, which I was lucky enough to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not surprised that a lot of the jobs that are recommended for people with ADHD, journalism is always on there, as well as social worker. That sense of social justice, I think, is very strong. That empathy, that wanting to help others. I think my theory is that it comes from living a life as a child, feeling so fundamentally misunderstood, right, and feeling so much self-doubt, and feeling a sense of wrongdoing, I guess, in our guts, that we tend to want to restore justice on some level.
That's a great point. Yeah, I think that's really true. I think also what might be a factor is that a lot of us in those years, 60s, 70s, grew up in families where there was like an authoritarian father. So you're rebelling against, that was my case for sure.
Yeah.
So,
Well, yeah, I mean, I had two very, very high achieving older brothers who went to, one of them went to MIT, the other one went to McGill. They were straight A scholarship kids. And I came along and my parents didn't know what to do with me, and so my mother was very much sort of like, well, you can't all of your kids can't be successful. Like she just would sort of pat me on the head and be like, well, you've got street smarts, not book smarts. That's what she used to say. And I think what really appealed to me about the newspaper environment, the newsroom, was that we were all this group of misfits who, yeah, like that we were all very bright and very quick-witted, but all like couldn't really function in normal elements of society, like getting straight A's and that kind of thing. And so I think, yeah, I see so much of why that appeals, that devil's advocate, and yeah, sticking it to the man and rolling up your shirt sleeves and all of that was so appealing. Yeah.
I have a good friend who would say that reporters are mostly depressed people who get a dopamine hit out of filing a story. So
Right.
it
Yeah.
feels, yeah.
What I am confused, I do, yes, I absolutely see all of that with deadlines and, kind of going home and knowing that you've done your job and then you can come back and what's happening tomorrow. It's book writing. I mean, that's what fascinates me. How on earth, as such a prolific writer, what works for you? What structures work for you in terms of being able to continually write books? Because that
With
feels like antithetical to the ADHD brain.
no, no, and like my mom and my older sister stopped doing it, and my mom unfortunately is gone. But they both would tell me all the time that I didn't have ADHD because I was a pretty good student and I was pretty productive. But I think with girls especially, we just developed that anxiety disorder to work that much harder and to just kind of white knuckle through it. But with books, it's a different thing. I think with books, I write nonfiction. I don't know if I could ever write a novel and keep all the different parts in my head, but with nonfiction, I have to tell you, it's actually a pretty easy thing to break it into little chunks. Even a memoir. With my latest book, it was sort of a memoir and a true crime story, Mothers and Murders. That was harder. I mean, it was more novelistic because I was weaving a story together of a murder case and my coming of age as a reporter. But and there were all these elements and characters, but I think the same rule does apply, that the more you break it into bite-sized chunks, and the hardest part is figuring out a system to do that. But once you have the system, it's just tasks.
Mm-hmm. And having lots of deadlines from your editor.
That's right. Or myself, or superimposed. Yeah. Deadlines help.
Um, yeah. And now, do you feel like did you feel like you had any sort of undiagnosed learning disorder growing up? Or, was that something you thought about, or were you just sort of like, this was my quirky self? Because I sort of felt like, I don't, my mother has also passed away. So she's like the one person I wanted to talk about this with the most, because there was so much that we struggled with together with me growing up, especially with doing so poorly in school. And I always sort of felt like looking back, I think like I had some sort of learning disorder, and why did nobody see those signs? Was
What do
that
you think you
anything?
had?
I
Do you
don't know.
think you
I
had like
mean, I thought I had maybe dyslexia, or I felt like it was really easy for me to take copious notes and research when it was like big projects, right? I think about like my honors thesis. I literally flew to Sri Lanka for a summer to do I took political science in university, and I wanted to do, I went to university. I'm old enough that still wasn't the internet, so we were doing like, researching in the library, and there just wasn't any there wasn't enough material for this thesis idea that I had about secession. um, and so I decided to fly there and do this research project, and I just took notes and interviews and did as much as I possibly could over the 4 months of my summer. And I came back and I just had this pile and I didn't know what to do with it. Like I just couldn't organize the information, and I just felt like sometimes you just get too much information. And I saw that so much in my schooling, where I would get really, really interested in a topic and really try to learn as much as possible about it, but the output I could never get to that part. And then I either wouldn't hand it in or would do a really crappy job and throw something together. And so those are those moments where I look back and I think I don't know what that could have, I didn't know enough about ADHD or my own brain to even be able to pinpoint like what that learning,
Do you think it's a
disorder would.
learning disorder, or is it just, I think the big thing for me about ADHD is that there's such a low threshold for boredom. And it's so exciting to run around, meet new people, collect all that information. The same friend of mine who said the thing about dopamine had this phrase, stuck on input, which I used in Buzz, because the input is so much more fun than the output. The output, you're all alone, right? So it might be something as simple as that, that it
Mhm.
just wasn't as much fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about that too with accomplishments, how difficult. I mean, I'd be curious, with what are your thoughts on imposter syndrome, or, feeling like you are so highly accomplished. I mean, you've won a Pulitzer, and yet do you feel like, like that, yeah, I did that. That's boring now. Can we talk about something else? Because, like I feel like sometimes it's very difficult to sit with our accomplishments as well. Um, when you manage to do something, you're on to the next thing immediately. And that's my other theory, is that I think that's why we tend to have very low self-esteem, because our own accomplishments tend to immediately become boring for us. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, no, I think that's a point. Throughout my life, I'm proud of a lot that I've accomplished, but I always have my own version of it. Like, I got into Stanford, but I was on a waiting list. I won a Pulitzer, but I did it with two other people. It wasn't a real Pulitzer, you know? And so, and so in my grandiose moments, I'll think, whoa, I deserve that Pulitzer. And then in other moments, it's just like, well, my shameful secret, right? And I don't know, I think people with ADHD, I mean, if you've ever encountered somebody with the beginnings of dementia, unfortunately, and they cover it all the time, right? It's just, and they invest so much energy in pretending that they're not forgetting things. So I think somewhere along the line, it became a point of pride with me to talk openly about mistakes and humiliating moments, because I could use the fact that I have accomplished some things to normalize them a little bit, try to make them a little less shameful for other people. So I will boast about really humiliating stuff, cringeworthy stuff. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think and I think that that's such a wonderful way to destigmatize ADHD as well. I had somebody DM me recently complaining about the fact that, I don't know if they were complaining or if this was a backhanded comment, but basically they were saying, your guests are so accomplished and you all seem so, together. Insinuating that we couldn't possibly have ADHD.
Exactly.
And
No,
to
that's really
realize that,
hard.
right, to realize that stigma
Yeah.
still exists for so many of us, where are the hot messes? And I'm like, oh, believe me, like all we talk about is what a hot mess we are. Um, but that, I feel like that what this is a good segue to talk about your most recent book, Mothers and Murderers,
But thanks.
because it's the learning from an error, I guess, right? I mean, it was sort of an ADHD relatable, impulsive mistake, right?
Yeah, and I did learn, I mean, it changed my life. It actually, if I trace it back, the path that it put me on, which was a different path than I've been on, was one that I just absolutely have loved. I think that indirectly it led to my meeting my husband, having the kids, going to Latin America. It just, but in the time when we make mistakes, and actually I just did a TED talk about this, about what people with ADHD can teach other people coming out of the pandemic, because the message is that we know better than other people how often everybody makes mistakes, and we know what to do with mistakes better because we make so many of them. So that you should, if you're feeling overwhelmed by all the information coming out of the pandemic, you should talk to somebody with ADHD, because even if we don't follow the best advice, we know what it is, right? So where was I? So um, The story in Mothers and Murders is I made this really dumb mistake. I basically charged a woman with murder where she hadn't been charged in a newspaper article, and she sued me and the newspaper for $11 million. And I thought my career was absolutely over. I was just less than 2 years of working at my first newspaper, and I just felt for sure I'm going to be blackballed and out of a job and never able to work again. And it was a really horrible feeling for quite a long time. But I think that if you're lucky with ADHD, and a lot of this means that you're able to face things clearly, because I think the worst thing about making mistakes like this is denying that it happened or blaming somebody else, or just forgetting it, right? If you, and the impulse to do those things is so strong. So if you are actually able to face your mistakes clearly and know that everybody makes them every minute of every day, you can grow from them. They're here to teach you. So I think that's what that book was about, just the difficulty, but the necessity of looking that mistake clearly in the face and trying to figure out how it happened.
Hmm. I do, yeah. I feel like I have talked a lot with some of my guests about grit and the ability to really kind of pick yourself up by the bootstraps. And that is something I think that we are quite adept at. Just, yeah, if it's because
Well, I don't know
we,
about we. I don't know about all people with ADHD. I wouldn't say like all people with ADHD have energy or grit. I think a lot of people are wiped out by ADHD, which is one reason that I do talk about this stuff. I mean, the people that you don't see on the podcast are people who've had crippling anxiety disorders or unable to produce anything, or have just decided that they are indeed a complete failure. And so that's why there's this whole faction of people who will say ADHD is a gift, right? It's a superpower. And I think we can get really easily carried away by that. It can be harmful in a way. Yes, look at a lot of the things that come with ADHD, like energy and excitement and just interestingness, are great, but they don't always come for everyone. And a lot of people are just weighed over by it.
yeah, yeah. And I think there has been such an incredible disparity too with some of my guests in terms of what accommodations they were given throughout life. And, I've noticed that a lot of the women I've spoken to who were diagnosed with something like dyslexia or another comorbidity younger in life and were given those accommodations had a very different outcome from some of us who, just kind of crashed and bashed our way through our education, or like it really, yeah, it dictates kind of your narratives. And again, like talking to people who their economic situations are completely different, or if their family situations were completely, like a lot of this. I feel like the more I talk about ADHD, the less I understand in terms of, is this, when we talk about ADHD, are we talking about the current kind of traits and behaviors that are being exhibited in the moment? Or are we talking about a neurodiversity, a neurodivergent brain that is seeking dopamine, and our environments are so different, and how we are nurtured are so different. Some of us, yeah, I think there's a lot of privilege in calling it a superpower for sure, when so many people didn't have that experience or still aren't having that experience. And so I think there's still so much confusion about even what are we talking about when we're talking about ADHD? Are we talking about, what behaviors you're exhibiting, or are we talking about the brain behind the behaviors? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it
Well,
depends on
definitely.
which book you're reading or which expert you're talking to. Now, what would
Yeah.
you say when you talk about ADHD, or when you sort of think about it? Are you thinking about it like it's in terms of the brain? I mean, that's what I get a sense when you talk about the dopamine deficiency and the dopamine seeking, that this is kind of a genetic neurotype, as opposed to behaviors being exhibited.
Well, I think the behaviors are the result of what's going on in your brain, right? And there's so much research that shows that it's got a huge genetic component. I think it's more than schizophrenia, but just a little less than height, in terms of its heritability. And in the book Buzz, I talked about my great grandfather, sorry about the dog barking, who he immigrated from Poland. So he had this restlessness that saved our family because he got the family out of Poland before World War II. But then he went back to Poland to collect an inheritance and gambled it all away in Monte Carlo. So I figured he was the original ADHD person in my family tree, or, there were probably people before him, but I could trace it back to him. And I do have a feeling that my father had some, but when you look into this stuff, that you get a genetic predisposition, and then your environment could influence it quite a bit.
Mhm.
So I know that there were things in my environment that probably increased it. So there was a lot of stress and conflict when I was growing up. We had a very loving family, but a little wacky too. So I think if you have somebody with the predisposition who's raised in a constant calm environment, their behavior might end up being quite different.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. If you had a
Katie, are you
chance,
familiar? Oh, sorry.
go ahead.
Are you familiar with Steve Henshaw's research on girls, about how it's so underdiagnosed in girls still? I mean, I think it's increased. Do you want me to? I'm going to close the door. Okay.
Okay.
Sure. Jack, can you get Daisy, please? Sorry about that. I think she's hungry. Anyway, if you're familiar, have you heard of Steve Henshaw?
No, I will definitely.
Yeah, he's somebody
Look into
definitely you should look into. I did a Washington Post story on girls with ADHD that cites his research, but you might be particularly interested in knowing that his research showed clearly that a lot of girls with a high proportion of girls with ADHD go on to attempt suicide, to cut themselves, there's a lot of really bad outcomes when it's not diagnosed and not dealt with in girls.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I feel like I've had many conversations about like self-medicating and our, proclivity for addictive behaviors and eating disorders. I mean, I certainly
That's very high.
Yeah, I struggled with binge eating and had no idea until my diagnosis that this was extremely common.
Right.
And it was fascinating to kind of think about why. And
Yeah.
so yeah, it's been really interesting. And now I have a son and a daughter, so it's been fascinating. My daughter's 14 and my son is 10.
Oh, wow.
So of course I'm like looking at everything they do with a fine-tooth comb because they both are very different. And yet I think, I see I see their neurodivergent tendencies in both of them in so many fascinating ways. But yeah, thank you for that. I will. I'll look into that. This is sort of, I've realized that this podcast is my research. This is how I learn best. So, and now one question I like to ask everyone, because I don't have an answer for it. So it's kind of unfair that I'm asking everybody else, but if you could rename ADHD to something else, if you had a chance, would you call it something else? Because I feel like that so many women especially are I think put off by that acronym and don't relate to that on any level in terms of their lived experience.
What suggestions are you getting? Because I'm not, none are coming to mind.
I know, right? Well, I mean, I think the VAST suggestion is great, although my only criticism with VAST is that it's not Googleable. VAST was put forth in ADHD 2.0, but I don't think it's Ned Hallowell's original. I don't think he came up with that acronym, but it's variable attention stimulus trait.
Oh my
And so
God.
I think the big difference is changing disorder to trait, which I think disorder can be really, problematic, and variable attention as opposed to deficit. And, it still doesn't address the emotional piece, which I think is, not only not in the DSM, but I think for most women, the biggest element is the emotional piece of that, the rumination and the rejection sensitivity and the difficulty with relationships and feeling like you're a bad woman, like just that the inability to perform mundane domestic tasks and what that does to your self-esteem as a wife and mother, and so I think that at the end of the day, the only thing I can come up with is dopamine deficiency, because I think really that, all of these seemingly random struggles that we have can be kind of traced back to this one, sense of easily bored and novelty seeking tendencies. And that's why we don't want to do the dishes. That's why we don't want to fold our laundry. And it's why we switch jobs every 2 years, we have difficulty with authority. Like at the end of the day, it always comes back to the dopamine. So that was sort of my, I feel like that would be what I would call it. But I don't know. I'm curious. I just feel like there's got to be a better way that we could sum this up into a diagnosis that women especially can relate to, as opposed to just saying, oh, you're just depressed. Here's some meds. And then we say, well, the meds aren't working. And then, what happened to me was I was on the depression and anxiety, this cocktail of antidepressants, and they weren't working. And so my doctor just kept upping the dose. And then I kept thinking, well, if it's this bad on the medication, imagine how bad it'll be off the medication. And I kind of just fell into that line of thinking for so many years before really this aha moment of oh my God, stimulants.
So they've made a big difference.
Well, actually, I tried them, and I'm not taking them in any regular way now, because I felt like I had actually, have come to a lot of different lifestyle changes that made sense to me, like morning exercise and and caffeine and
caffeine always.
And so like I think I've just been able to kind of adjust my behaviors in a way that I haven't really felt like I needed the medication. I do have it in my desk drawer, but it's such a pain and it's so expensive to get. I don't use it on a daily basis because I think it doesn't occur to me that I might want it until it's too late in the day for me to take it. For me, that's the great irony of my stimulant medication. But I'm also not on an SSRI anymore either. I'm not on anything for the first time in 20 years. So
yeah. Well, I don't see any shame in taking whatever medication you need, but there's also so much research that's so strongly in favor of exercise, which I think that's one of the few things that has really added to my own resilience, such as it is. I've always been an exercise nut. I've been addicted to it, and I can't spend a day without doing something. And I definitely feel the effect on my brain and ability to think clearly after I've done something aerobic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I feel like you articulate so well that thought process and that journey with medication, for children as a parent, and feeling, like just the mistrust of the drug companies and mistrust of the people who are working, the scientists who are being paid by the drug companies, and also the long-term effects, and all of that. And so I really appreciate you kind of going through that in your book.
Well, I really came out on the side of, if it works for you, it's fine. They seem to be safe. But, like you say, there is so much really not great news about some of the research being done and what drug companies will do, that it could reasonably put you off. I think they shoot themselves in the foot, frankly.
Mm-hmm. That was a really interesting part. All of the stuff about chat, I didn't know about that. I hope if people are listening and they haven't read their book, they will pause this episode and go listen to. I listened, so it was lovely to hear you read it too.
Thank you.
I hope people will go and listen to it. It's a great memoir. I'm curious now. It's been 16 years. How is your oldest son doing? He's got to be in his mid-20s at this point, right?
I'm so happy to say he's got a fiance. He's got a great job. He seems to be really happy, so I'm very happy to say that, that phrase, you're only as happy as your least happy child. And for a while, both of us were pretty miserable. Mm-hmm. But Yeah, he's a super, super interesting kid. You know, he's the kind of kid who taught himself Russian, and he travels around the world. He's really adventurous. He's pretty great. And
That's
my other
awesome.
son too. Yeah.
Oh yes, he
Not
was
quite.
delightful
Not
too.
quite.
Now,
Yeah.
although I kept listening to the book thinking like Max must have ADHD as well. Like I just feel
No, no,
like
no. I don't think
um
so.
just because he was, I just think of that joie de vivre, I associate that with ADHD. Maybe that's my own bias.
Joie de vivre. Why don't we just call it that?
Right, that's a great name, actually. That's true. Um, no, and I think so much of the adult diagnosis experience is a lot of that grief of feeling like, oh, if so much of my life could have been different if I had known. And so I think it's lovely to watch this younger generation growing up, feeling like, knowing that they are not broken somehow, the way I think so many women I interview, and so certainly my experience, feeling like there was something just wrong with us this whole time, and so it's encouraging to think
Yeah,
of.
like I say, I resist that whole, it's a gift kind of course, but I really do like the neurodiversity idea that society needs all kinds of brains. And if we can just find ways to be more comfortable with our own individual way of working, then that's terrific. And we all contribute something.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And that we all are kind of on this, it's really feel like there's, when you talk about disabilities, the issue is always really about accommodation. The disability is only there because you don't have the accommodation that is needed, and so you can think about that with neurodivergency as well. I mean, you know, oh, did I mention you talked about the education system in your book too, which I think is also really another important part of parenting children with ADHD is the public, just navigating public school. Speaking of lack of accommodations, but that how so much of our experience would be so different if we were kind of met where we were. I like to think of
Yeah.
it as, when I explain ADHD to my children, I explain it by using the example of being left-handed, where I say, if you're left-handed and you can't cut, and everybody says, well, why just use the scissors properly? And you don't understand why they're not working. They're working for everybody else. Or you're sitting at a desk that's not accommodated for you, and you don't understand. Nobody's telling you why this desk feels uncomfortable for you, and you're trying desperately to write with the right hand, and you just can't do it. So that's how I
It's
tend to look at it.
crazy. Yeah, it's crazy that schools just expect kids to be able to sit for hours at a time, just processing one subject after another, when so many kids aren't, they just can't do it. And it's misery. I remember just being completely miserable. I mean, I got the work done, but it was torture.
Oh, I
Um,
know. Yeah. And again, I think it's just getting harder and harder the bigger the classrooms are, and the lack of leverage that teachers have anymore. I think the
mhm.
recess is the first thing that's taken away when somebody is misbehaving, which just defeat, which
It's
is
nuts. Yeah, they
the
still
worst
do
thing you
things
could
like
do.
that.
Yeah. So I think that's a whole other issue, but I don't want to keep you any longer. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you, Katie. It's really been interesting to talk
Uh,
with you, and good luck with your podcast
awesome.
and your
Wonderful.
journey.
Well, thank you
Okay.
again. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.